All right, so now let's move on to money laundering.
This is the how-to guide, right?
There's so many pictures you could have used.
Which of these scenarios could indicate money laundering?
I just realized who that was. Why are you picking on him?
I know, not the right. I guess we're being neutral, right?
Yep.
We're being
All right.
neutral.
If a customer makes large deposits and maintains large balances with little or no apparent justification, is that money laundering? Just making big deposits and maintaining a big balance. Does that trigger your money laundering? Does it pass the sniff test? What do you think?
Which one was it again? I'm sorry.
A
first
customer
one?
makes large deposits and maintains large balances with little or no apparent justification.
I think it's a red flag. So if you do you apply your know your customer program to this client, and they are a student who works part-time at a retail store, and all of a sudden they have large deposits and they maintain large balances, then that's something that should be a red flag to you.
So in the banking industry, with the know your customer standards, it sounds like it's more than just filling out that card you fill out when you get a bank account with your social and your contact info. It seems like the regulatory regime is requiring y'all to do more.
Card.
I was
gonna say.
It's way
What
more than
bank
a card now.
did you open an
I've had
account
a
at?
checking account for a while.
It's a legal contract.
I think I got my checking account in the 90s. So.
It's not a card anymore.
It is the way we look at from an anti-money laundering perspective, and this would go for counter-terror finance as well. It's most efficient for us to detect this stuff at what we call the top of the funnel. So when you're onboarding clients, so the more rigorous you are at the top of the funnel, the less money, less effort you have to put in theoretically down towards the bottom of the funnel, where you have to start staffing with specialized personnel, specialized technology, which we'll talk about later. So it really is a benefit for us to increase the amount of information, the more we know about each client, each prospect coming through the doors, because it actually does equate to less spend if you can keep bad actors, or those that, I wouldn't even call them bad actors, because we're not going to catch a ton of bad actors, to be quite honest, but you want to look for who don't you want in your portfolio, and you just try to increase the friction to ensure that they don't get in. It's a difficult thing to do, but KYC is the kind of the way that we do it.
All right, our next scenario. A customer changes his or her deposit from more than $10,000 to less than $10,000 upon notification of currency transaction report filing requirements. So you had someone who was depositing a whole lot of money at once, more than $10,000, and you told them you now have to report that to the feds, and they are depositing less. Does that make your money laundering spidey senses go off? Oh yeah.
Being that it is an actual criminal violation, yeah, it should.
I would be worried if that one's the easy one, right? You know, we've all watched, like we were talking about Ozark, right? We all watched the shows where, you know, you put 9,000, or all the mob movies, you put $9,999 in at a time, and you know, which obviously
Like no one's gonna catch that.
Right. But you know, you put small amounts in at a time to try to avoid the reporting requirements, and it works in the movies, but I assume that doesn't work in real life either.
No, you can't. Actually, we educate the clients about it. What we don't educate them about is that we're monitoring all of the transactions around those thresholds, in order to detect when folks intentionally try to evade that. And that is I believe it's a Title 31 violation. It's cash, or structuring of cash or monetary instruments. So we are looking at it's a nice little crime. We can actually get people for it, and have in the past, but it is part of the Bank Secrecy Act. It's one of the areas where we often look. I don't think we're going to go into the stages of money laundering today, but that placement stage where they're bringing cash, physical currency in, is the easiest place to detect money laundering. That's the whole reason for the structuring statute. And so we're always monitoring the transactions around. It depends on the bank, depends on the client segment, where we're looking to see where someone is intentionally not depositing that at that $10,000 or just below that $10,000 level.
You said the whole intent is to detect money laundering, but the criminal provision applies just by splitting up the deposit,
Right.
irrespective of whether it's money laundering.
Correct, which is
Yeah, that's a
very
good point.
problematic for us because we're required to report on all of those, even if it is, this is a certain ethnic communities that do not trust the banking system because they've been abused in their home country will regularly structure because they are afraid that if something is reported to the U.S. government, that similar things that happened to them in their previous country would happen to them here. So we certainly see it. We've seen it in Vietnamese communities, Somali communities. They will now they're not laundering money. They're truly afraid. And so what we'll do is we will reach out. We have targeted education campaigns. And most banks do, where if they see that activity in someone that doesn't have any other red flags, they'll actually send out literature. They'll have a banker talk to them to say, hey, listen, this isn't anything nefarious. It's something that we're required to do by law. Please make sure if you've got that cash on hand that just deposit all of it. It's actually safer for you. We talk to them about personal safety as well. So a lot of these are small businesses, and they'll hoard their cash, and they'll only make small deposits because they're afraid of the reporting, and it puts them in a physical security kind of quandary when they're storing that much cash in their businesses. Most of these are small businesses, so we try to do that, and it does work.
Well, I mean, one thing is, and don't want to contradict it does work, part of it for that specific crowd, but looking at some of the stats right before this meeting, talking about up to $1 to $2 trillion in annual money laundering activity globally. This represents close to 5% of the world GDP. You can imagine the size of money laundering and what's happening from a global perspective. And now coming back to John's comment, I was looking at, okay, well, what percentage of this is actually being captured? We know that it's happening. It's 1%. So of that $1 to $2 trillion annual money laundering, only 1% is actually seized, according to UN reports. So it's interesting that all the monitoring effects and all the things that banks are trying to do and putting into effect, it seems like the launderers are continually maneuvering around that and around the system. And maybe a lot of that is coming outside the United States, yes. But the number is definitely mind-boggling.
And that's why I think your kind of point of sale or controls are the best. I mean, KYC, as you mentioned, so just knowing the client up front and as much about that client as possible. And then at the kind of the transaction point of sale, where if a client is structuring, capture it then, as opposed to it getting into the system. And then, because once it's in the system or within our bank, then it becomes potentially more of a liability for us from a reputational risk perspective too.
Yes. One thing I was going to ask you guys, and this is another thing that's been fairly recent with cryptocurrencies and the availability of blockchain. My understanding is that now blockchain is seen as a technology that can actually help reduce or eliminate money laundering as a result of the transaction non-repudiation and the fact that you have a ledger that is cannot be manipulated by the sender or recipient. Is that actually happening in the banking system already?
So banks are still very, very reluctant to deal with cryptocurrency. And although everything that you're saying is correct, there are better detection methodologies now for looking at cryptocurrency. So when has a client used some sort of a blunder and to basically mask where they're at in the ledger, mask their identity within the ledger, which gives us some very, very good red flags. But the existence of that ledger, now that we've got enough transactions through the blockchain to look at bad nodes and connect people to bad nodes and then block based on their affiliation with bad nodes. And when we say bad node, this would be somebody that has used cryptocurrency for nefarious activities in the dark web, for instance. So it's a known user of picking up child porn in the dark web. anyone that's associated with that user in the ledger, you spider out a certain number of nodes, and they'll kind of draw a circle around that and say bad node. So that data is available. So as banks get access and start getting more comfortable with utilizing blockchain technology or utilizing the blockchain and the public ledgers, you can start to map where this is and see where you've got good users and potentially bad users and block that way. But there are still quite a few banks out there that do not deal with cryptocurrency at all.
I think a lot of it's just an infrastructure thing too. I mean, well, there's it's new, the technology, and to what you were just talking about with respect to it as reducing money laundering. I think you have to get over the hump of just the risk of accepting it to begin with. I think before you can start realizing those benefits, and most banks don't have an appetite to take that initial leap.
Yeah. And at $4,000 per Bitcoin right now, we're seeing a lot of Bitcoin cash out transactions right now. As people are, they bought it $300 a Bitcoin, and now it's 4,000. So we've got a lot of people buying homes in very nice places off of their Bitcoin earnings.
Our next scenario kind of gets at this idea of how of know your customer and how it gets a little more complicated when you're not dealing with human beings anymore. A business customer opens or maintains multiple LLC companies where beneficial ownership is not clearly documented. Is that a scenario that could indicate money laundering? What do you guys think?
Could. Really, we don't have enough information right there. You have, especially in this area where we live, we have a lot of people that structure very legitimately for tax reasons, for personal security reasons. There's a lot of money flowing around, and they will utilize these corporate structures in order to ensure that they can keep some level of anonymity and control. Especially we've seen it in the past with high net worth individuals that want to make charitable donations and they want to do it anonymously. It really depends on the situation, but of course. Business customers, multiple LLCs, bad beneficial ownership information, absolutely a red flag. Absolutely a red flag. You just need more information, more due diligence.
And this is kind of a hot spot for regulators right now. I mean, ultimate beneficiary. I mean, because to your point, we're seeing more and more of these legitimately. So because of just the sheer volume, the uptick in volume, I think bad doers are taking advantage of that and trying to slip in some of these phony multi-layered LLCs. So it's something that's on the radar of the regulators.
Yeah, and actually we've got a FinCEN new CDD rule coming out, or implementation in May of next year, which every financial institution is going to have to up their beneficial ownership responsibilities as part of their due diligence, and that's going to be significant in that space.
All right, and our last one. A customer inquires into various forms of money transfer, all for amounts greater than $10,000. Does that trigger money laundering?
Anything? Any guesses? Could. Anyone have a guess? I'll throw this back. Anyone have a guess on what is the trade? Or I just gave it away. What's the product that launders more money globally than any other? Now, I will tell you right now, it's not a checking account. It's not something we catch doing cash structure. Now close. Trade finance transactions, global trade transactions. You can move tremendous amounts of money very, very quickly through a trade finance transaction. Excellent example of this would be I've got a front organization in a non-extradition jurisdiction and we're dealing in textiles. Let's say we've got a shirt manufacturer in Southeast Asia for t-shirts. There are t-shirt manufacturers all over that drop and pop up every day in Southeast Asia. It's very hard. It's a commodity. It's hard to price. You can do just about anything if you want to move some t-shirts from Southeast Asia to, let's say, Mexico City for printing. manipulating an invoice. Say you're moving 1 million units. Maybe you're buying those units at 10 cents a piece. Well, you just manipulate the invoice and say they're $1 a piece. Who's going to catch that? You can move money all day long. So in my previous work in law enforcement, there's a lot of attention on trade finance transactions. The thing that's sad is that it's very difficult to disrupt these networks because they're also used by intelligence agencies, legitimately, very legitimately, because we need to keep track of folks that are out there. And so drug traffickers and people that we want to arrest, or those same networks are being utilized to move money for others. And so we tend to watch them rather than interdict. But a lot of money is moved through trade finance transactions. It's very difficult to get beneficial ownership information on them. You're dealing with entities and banks overseas that don't have the same requirements as U.S., so it's quite interesting. It's a fascinating space to look at money laundering.
All right, and just a basic definition of money laundering. Money laundering generally refers to financial transactions in which criminal, including terrorist organizations, attempt to disguise the proceeds, sources, or nature of their illicit activities. Money laundering facilitates a broad range of serious underlying criminal offenses and ultimately threatens the integrity of the financial system. Rick, could you give us just briefly some examples of the types of people who are more susceptible to money laundering, just by nature of what they do for a living and their knowledge?
More susceptible to be involved in
Right.
money laundering schemes? Well, so one of the things we do when we onboard clients is most banks do is the risk rate a client based on what they do. If it's an individual or a consumer or commercial client. For consumers, attorneys are considered higher risk. CPAs, people who know the law, people who know the tax revenue ins and outs, high cash businesses, car washes. I mean, back in my day, video game parlors, stuff like that. And there's pretty much most banks keep a running list of that. So those are a couple of examples, and John, I'm sure you could throw like 100 more on that. But those are a couple of examples of who we would consider higher risk as a client or transacting with, just because of what I explained.
Yeah, and I find it interesting. I think most people, when we think money laundering, we think about the car wash, the laundromat. We don't think about the attorney or the accountant. And we were talking about Ozark, if you haven't seen that. But it's, it's an accountant who's laundering the money.
Or Get Sal.
Right.
Breaking Bad.
It's not just the guy that is, at the laundromat where people are paying quarters.
Yeah, and we call them gatekeepers in the industry. So any gatekeeper occupation, accountants, lawyers, formation agents, they're all what we would consider freight forwarders or another gatekeeper industry. So there are quite a few gatekeeper industries that are out there that we pay particular attention to for that specific reason.
For example, from Russia, they're coming here and getting like refugee status or something, and they are having this political asylum or how it's called. So they bring a lot of money here, but how they got it when they are like moving to the US? These people.
Non-resident aliens are typically a higher risk category within financial institutions, so we take a little bit closer look at them and their transactions. Most of them are not going to be walking into a branch with suitcases of cash. Most cases, it'll be wire transactions that are coming in that we'll pay particular attention to.
What is the nature of that money?
We'll ask them. We'll actually ask them. Yeah, it's a great question, and we do ask them those questions. What's the nature of the money? We will ask them for documentation sometimes. If they say, "Oh, it's the sale of a house in Moscow or an apartment that we had there," we'll ask them for the sales document documents in Russian, have them translated, and look at the veracity of their claim. If their claim stands up, we'll let them keep it. If it doesn't, they're going to be finding another bank.
And country of origin, so non-resident alien, country of origin, all that could factor into a higher risk rating, and the higher risk rating of the prospect or the client then correlates to our due diligence. And so it could be, for someone like me probably walking into a bank to open deposit accounts, it's a customer due diligence, basic KYC. For someone with some of these other triggers, it would be what we call an enhanced due diligence. And depending on the bank, depending on the line of business within the bank, sometimes that could be more or less. And to John's point, even to the extent of asking for or requesting confirmation with respect to source of funds before we take that money.
But they can make any documents in their country.
They could, but the regulatory burden that we have to meet is we have to make a reasonable effort, and it has to pass a reasonableness test that says if another person, another compliance officer in a similar position looked at this document, would they make the same decision? So that's really the only hurdle we've got to pass. But you would be surprised. Yes, people can make a lot of documents, but they typically, if they're really involved in nefarious activity, they'll do it once. There's always a pattern. And it's typically not criminal activity if they do it once and they never do it again. What we usually see is they do it once, and greed motivates like anything else. They do it once, and they do it twice, and they do it 3 times. When they start to get to that 3, 4, 5 times, we've already built the profile that we needed in order to take action.
It's interesting that multiple times that John's talking about, a lot of the more sophisticated people who want to take advantage of that system would actually not use the same bank the second time, and then go to the second and third bank. And now there's a whole group of machine learning AI type technology that tracks, we were talking about this just right before this, kind of cross-organization laundering. So this bank, that bank, and you see common behavior, but tracking that kind of thing requires the banks to start sharing information as it relates to money laundering, and that's, we were just talking about, I don't know how popular that's become, but technologies have been built to look at that trend, see a common behavior, see a common pattern, and make a decision that this is something we've seen before, this looks suspicious. So,
and we do have provisions of the Patriot Act. Provision 314B of the Patriot Act allows us to have specific conversations with other banks. They have to be specific conversations to talk about, hey, I've got this person that just came in. They said they used to bank at your bank. Why are they not banking at your bank anymore? And we'll talk to each other about that. But still, it's of course, the best place for us to be would be in a position where we were able to build a consortium of banks that share data on this. It's very, very difficult. Fraud does it. Fraud has consortium data, but the difference with fraud is that you've got hard losses.
mm-hmm.
But you have this credit rating, you also can have something like that.
But a lot of regulations around the
Consortium data?
Around using credit scores for very specific purposes. And the thing with money laundering is there's been no crime proven. People have not been provided. Thank you. we have to remind ourselves of that a lot because we
have privacy laws and whatnot we have to follow. So.
Yeah.